Before we get to Ward here, another thing just from a simpleton is maybe a little bit of a response from my perspective. Is the reason that we have our laws of science that actually work is because we've discovered what God actually created. And we can know that because we can run them through the scientific method and prove them beyond hypothesis and even theory to actually replicate it every time so we know it's a law. And what they're doing is, I used to call it theories. These guys have educated me that they're not even close to theories of all this quantum physics and all of that. And so they can't be replicated and because it just doesn't work. So therefore, they're not laws and they're not correct, at least not the way they're going at them right now. They could make another run at it, which they do, so they can keep the funding because they have to keep coming up with new theories so that they get up tax money to do those kinds of things. You know, that's part of it. So, Ward, you want to tell us a little bit about what a farm boy from western Kansas, how you come to know Jesus? Okay.
I'll tell you. I'll tell you my story. Yeah, farm boy, western Kansas, out by Oberlin. I grew up in a non-Christian home. My mother and father were by all definition, very good, moral people. Yeah, but religion was not something in which they were interested in. Neither one of them came from a background either. Neither one of their families were believers. So I grew up. God had me grow up in this this type of environment, and put a neighbor who lived out in the country. Closest neighbor is 2 miles away. Closest church was about 12 miles away. It's a little country church. So the neighbor 2 miles away has got a little bit older, kind of like around preschool type of age. They would offer to take me to church. They had 4 children. I was in their house quite a bit, playing. They were our place quite a bit, playing as well. So offered to my parents if wouldn't mind if they just stopped in and picked me up and take me to church when they go. So my parents thought, oh, that's fine. My mom would always have me ready to get in their station wagon full of them and their family, their kids, and we would go to this church. That was a covenant church in the middle of a Swedish community, settled out there by a bunch of Swedes that were very faithful and religious and loved the Lord. So I would go to church with them. My parents would not go unless there was a program or something like that I was involved in. But it was this family that would pull in, and they were always running late, and they were harried. But it doesn't matter. They're still going to pick me up and take me to church. So that's where I learned about the Bible, or about our God and Jesus, and I didn't learn any of that at home at all. And so it's something which then went through their confirmation class that came up about 12, 13 years of age, and I professed Christ at that point in time. So what happens then soon after that age is that we get driver's license. So I didn't have to have a ride to church anymore. And then that would drive and go to church on a regular basis, and then that started to wear off. After sports events, we'd have also sometimes we had wrestling was a big sport in our school, so we'd have a lot of tournaments on Saturdays. So get home late from a tournament, going to church was not a high priority that next morning. So that became less and less of a priority for me to go to church there. Back up a little bit, maybe you'll probably remember in that some of my, introduction. Steve would kind of do a little interview with me. And part of that is that I decided or determined I would become a veterinarian when I was in the third grade. So that meant I needed to pursue all of the sciences that I could. I thought to the best veterinarian that I possibly could. I need to know all of this science. I need to learn it, and I need to know it. So going through the science and having the evolution being taught as fact and learn it that way, and not having any type of explanation or anything to that effect from the church on creation, refute it, or anything to that effect. So what happened then was my dive into science to be the best veterinarian I thought it could possibly be drove a wedge between the first part of the Bible and the last part of the Bible. Because if the first part doesn't fit, doesn't work, and doesn't have a good explanation versus what I'm learning in science with the evolution and creationism, then why should there be a lot of reliability placed in on the last part, the Gospels? So that does affect the approach. It does affect the attitude toward knowledge and acceptance of the Bible. Well, lo and behold, later in my high school years, then fell away from living a Christian life, and I carried on into college as well. Interestingly enough, too, I don't know if I ever shared this before or not, but I was just thinking about it a little further, was that there's 6 of us country boys that were in that confirmation class. 4 of us, fell away and weren't living the Christian life for high school to college type of thing. But I think all four of us have come back and are Christians, regular believers, living a good Christian life, and doing things in churches, a little bit along those lines. The thing, though, as I was going through, I'd never disbelieved in God and Jesus, but there's always a big conflict with the creationism, evolution, a big conflict there. So as I would go through my college classes, and then I would always ask, whenever I'd have a biology class, I would always ask the professor, the thing that bugged me was that, how did the mutations add new information if we came from a common ancestor? We came from a one-cell organism, or a small, the original amoeba, the original organism, that then supposedly, through natural selection, and then supposedly gained more information and divided and built more and more cells into us as humans. Where did that information come from? How did that happen to be able to look at evolution and all that really made logical sense with this? So where did the information come from? How did that add on? And I never had a really good explanation. It was anytime the professors would address that, would be that, well, and this is basically the summary of it. Well, you just don't know enough right now, and that you just don't understand evolution at this time, and that it works. Just trust me. So I found myself actually in some of my years in pre-vet, I actually went to the veterinary school to go to the library and look up origins, evolution, and things to that effect. And essentially didn't have a lot, would not be able to find a lot on that, except the proposed mechanism of the theory of evolution, capital E, evolution, that how we came from small one-cell organisms as a common ancestor, and it just split out, and here we are. That's let alone asking the question of where did that first life originate from? But that was something which I struggled with, and then I thought, well, if I get into veterinary school and really learn my science well, and then get into veterinary school, there'll be somebody there that will know. And so you get into veterinary school, and the teachers are doctors of veterinary medicine, plus they have another doctorate. So we affectionately call them doctor. So they're going to really know. So there's going to be geneticists, there are doctor geneticists, there's going to be doctor pathologists, physiologists. I'm going to be able to get that answer. And it basically, in trying to get the answer of how that mechanism really worked to gain the information, how did we perpetuate by mutations and become more and more complex with more and more information that's being passed on. How did that happen? I never could get a good answer from any of the professors there at veterinary school. And that's basically when it really dawned upon me, was that evolution, capital E, evolution, is basically a faith, it's a faith system without hope. And that's, and with that, it just made me realize is that, wasting a lot of time worrying about this, the creation and evolution, to where the answer is right there in the Bible all along. That's where the true truth is. It's not in higher education. And we're talking about some things just in general that folks are concerned about, is that what is the truth? About laws of science, our political laws, and all that. But it was in veterinary school when I really came back around and just decided that the Bible is correct, and then the theory of evolution is a man-made thing, no hope there, and that once I did that, what a big relief. Things were not in contention any longer with science and with the with the faith. There was congruency. It all worked together. So anyway, that's my story of starting with belief, falling away, partially through indoctrination. Can't really blame that, but that was a good excuse that I provided for myself at the time. But then come back around. And it's prepared me, I think, to be able to be standing where I am right now, to where I can be able to stand up and tell folks about the truths that are in the Bible from a scientific standpoint, and that make a lot more sense, a lot more rational logic. And also, if someone has questions, or talking to someone who is a skeptic, and because I used to be there, just like all of us, we used to be there. If they're talking about the evolution, talking about Darwin, it'd be one of those things which I can look them in the eye and say, I used to believe that. Let me tell you what straightened me out on that, and that type of a thing. So it's helped me to be able to be here and be able to share these times together with you all. So anyway, thank you very much.
Here. You know, it's interesting listening to Ward. The worked with him for a number of years, and you learn something about him. I didn't know all of his past history and everything growing up and the things that formed him and everything. So it's always enheartening to gain knowledge of the people you're around and everything. We've talked, as Steve brought out at one point, is we're not against science, we're just against false science. And they say, well, you believe in the Bible, that's not science. And we're saying, no, this is science, and that is not science, this evolution and all this Big Bang and all these Mickey Mouse, I hate to say them, theories that you're putting, not theories, hypotheses you're putting out there that have no scientific basis at all. What we're going to do now is jump a little bit more. We're coming back to what the scriptures teach more about social institutions that God's established that we live in. Science is a great thing, but it doesn't tell us much about our families, except it does tell us that there are only two sexes. It tells us a lot of things that are pretty basic that you see our society is drifting away, and you say, where'd this come from? This isn't even science. This isn't even a story. It's a certain foolishness. So we're going to go into some of these other aspects of what do the scriptures teach. I had an interesting professor at Dallas Seminary, Dr. Pentecost, and he wrote the Things to Come. It's kind of the reference book for prophecy. But I had him for several courses, Thessalonians and Colossians and everything. And he got into this, that there are certain realms that are talked about that God's established. There's God, there's the family, the father, the mother, and the children. You have God, church, and the members of the church. You have God, you have the workplace, the people that work in there. You have God, you have the government, you have the citizens of the governments. These are lines of authority that God's established. And as he's going through these, a lot of these guys are going to become pastors. Wasn't on that track. But they agreed with the thing where they're the head of the family as men, and that they're going to be the head of their church as a pastor. And they were going to be, as a workplace, they're the head. They don't have an employer over them. They're the head of the thing if they had any employees in the church. Then they came to the deal about being in the workplace. Several of these guys were working as teamsters over there at the unloading docks and everything like this. And he said, well, he said, here we've got a situation of God and the master and the servant. And he said, unions are unbiblical. These guys came out of the blocks. And they said, and he said, listen, let me read you these passages. I said, now, he said, you're going to be the head of the family, okay? Be the head of your church. And you'll be, you may not be in the government. But he says, in the workplace, you're not on the top. And he says, and the unions are trying to tell the masters how to run their operations. And they push back real hard, and he says, let me tell you something. You can write this on the wall. He says, if you don't agree with this, where you're on the underneath side, want to go along with that, then he says, God's going to work havoc in your family and in your church, wherever you're in authority. He says, write it on the wall. And everyone got, wait a minute. He says, they said, well, what are we going to do? We got to pay to go to school here. He says, pray that the Lord gives you a place to work that's not in a union. And he says, write it simply. You want to protest? He says, you'll pay this price down the road. So what we have in the scriptures, we have a social structure that God has laid out very clearly, both in the Old Testament and the New, modified, of course, in the New because men don't have multiple wives. They're not supposed to. And certain things where in the Old Testament it was given that they could have a wife. In fact, if your brother died with his wife and didn't have offspring, then you were supposed to marry her. That was the case that you have in Boaz and Ruth. There was closer than Boaz to Ruth. And he says to the guy, he says, well, if you buy this land, you got to take Ruth. Oh, he says, I can't do that. And so Boaz got Ruth as a wife because he was a second in line, but those were things in the Old Testament. We don't have those things in the New Testament. Solidarity is just one wife, one husband. In fact, one of the qualifications of elders is that they're a husband of one wife. And it reverses that term in Greek for the widows. It says a widow is only wife of one man. And so it makes a strict difference that the church can't support a widow who hasn't been wife of one man. I mean, there's certain strictures that you have. We're going to cover a few of those. You're going to say, well, this is political. No. Politics has gone into the question of what the scriptures teach for us in the church. And the interesting thing is, if in these lines of order, there's not rebellion at the bottom, unless one that is over that starts to walk out of the line and take over authority. There's only distinct authorities that exist in a family. There's only ones in the government, in the workplace, and in the church. Now, if you have an elder, for instance, that goes bad, we have a procedure for that. Approach it, bring it up before the church, because there's elders that go bad. And if a husband wants something from the wife that's not possible, he wants her to do things that are against what God commands very clearly, that are not in his area of authority, she doesn't have to obey it. And children to some degree, at a lesser degree. So you have these things, and if the government, for instance, steps over into the realm of the church, steps over in the realm of the family, or steps in the realm of the work relationships, it's invalid. There can be revolt against that and say, you don't have to get violent about it. You say, that's not your authority. You can't do that. Those are the places that, but you have to know what these lines of authority are and what's given to whom and what you have to go along with. In some cases, wives have to submit to husbands that are not demanding something of them that's wrong. And that's why Paul says, wives, if you're married to an unbeliever, then don't live with him peacefully. But if he departs, then you're free. And just remain separate. Unless they remarry, then they're free totally. So we have these things. And our culture we live in was very strongly influenced as a Judeo-Christian, as a biblical-based society. And particularly in the early stages of America. The reason we had America is because they had persecution in Europe and came here. Most of your ancestors, or a lot of them, came here to get the freedoms they were entitled to from the government and from the church. There are state churches there that are not authorized in scriptures. So we had a lot of that at the beginning. Now, I think that Satan is drifting things over and taking this in a way that is into the area of absurdity and in violence. You look at Sodom and Gomorrah. That's before the law. What was God's view of that? Not very pleasant. Or you have the case of Noah, where the people are departing. What happens? God makes statements even before he's laid down a lot of these rules that we live in. And you say rules, they're areas of freedom. If we follow the biblical patterns, we're going to have good lives. when I was younger, I remember society was a lot different than it is today. We went on a vacation, left our house open, locked the doors, and our cars parked out there and left the keys in them so that they were there when we wanted to climb into the car, just rolled up the window so it didn't rain in them and things like that. That's the way society. I lived in a town, they'd only had probably 2 murders. This is a town of about 10,000 in their whole history. Those don't exist today. The society is changing. It's moving away from a biblical-based society. It gets worse, worse, worse. The other thing that grinds it out is the reason we were economically very successful is because we were following biblical patterns. If a man's honest, you're dishonest as selling things against him as a competitor, you'd lose business to him because he's always honest. So even unbelievers had to obey the same rules. Well, let's look at some of the things. Uh-oh. Did it lose its mind? Oh, that always helps. It should be green. Just hit the next button. Okay. Okay. We're coming back to this in the first law that we went into. We did it in the series. This is the basic laws, 2 basic laws of science that you can get almost all of your lives of science out of this. The first law is the one that we get probably 70 to 80% of our laws of science from: conservation of momentum, angular momentum, all your electromagnetism, field theories, and everything come out of this. What this does is it says that here we're at the present time. Here's time, present time. This is matter and energy in the whole universe, and it's constant for all time. It means that tomorrow there'll be the same amount of matter and energy there is today. There was 1,000 years ago, and will be, if it continues, 1,000 years from now, it'll be constant. It's just the quantity law. And then you have what? Oh, there we go. Back up. All too fast. Okay. Well, the second law just says that although the quantity is constant, the useful amount of energy is declining. If we go back in time, you go back to a point. Here we're at the present time. You go back to a point where the useful energy equals the total energy, and the universe couldn't exist before that period of time. And what you can do from that, the second law is responsible for 15. Going backwards. That's good. See, that's the useful law. It just says that it's going down. Here we're at the present time. We've used up so much of it, and we've got so much left. Eventually, we'll have the same amount of matter and energy, but it'll be spread over the whole universe. And energy in deep space will rise from about 2.7 degrees absolute. That's absolute is minus 460 degrees Fahrenheit. So that's how cold it is. It'll be almost at that temperature. It'll rise up to about, when all the stars are burning out in galaxies, it'll be about 4 degrees above absolute zero. Yeah. What we had, we'll back up to that. What we had in the problem with this, with the second law coming in, that was in Genesis 3. The creation of everything was in 1 and 2, and everything was good until the second law came into effect. And then you have these other things that affected us personally. You have pain, sorrow, pain, curse, toil, death, and you have a separation from God. It's far from what God created the thing. And so we're on a decline thing. Next one. We have judgments like the flood we go into in Genesis 6 through 9. Terrible thing, like, I quoted that senator today. I couldn't believe he said, well, like in the days of Noah. She's sitting there and said, well, all the naysayers and the deniers were all perished in the flood. You have the Ice Age, second judgment coming after, and then you have the tower. That's where we all divided up. We used to have all one language, and now we're divided not by race, but we're divided. Contrary to evolution, we're not divided by race, we're divided by languages. Then we're dispersed over the whole. We were supposed to spread out originally over the whole earth, but people didn't want to. They wanted to stay there, and so God, at the Tower of Babel, confused our languages, and so we were forced to spread. You're talking to your guy that you're working next to, and you can't understand, and you get away from him, take your family, and go someplace else. And so we're spread across the face of the earth now. Creation in the fall, we had perfect order with God. Man had dominion over the nature. We had marriage. We had the family. Oh, I don't even get into that. Imperfect order as a consequence of the fall. We have government, we have kings, we have tyrants, everything. We have Satan's dominion. The reason he wants to control the governments is to control people and squeeze down on them. He doesn't want people free, worship God, and to live free lives. We can live very freely with only a minimum amount of government. We need government for certain things that we can't do, like building our roads and water systems. All these things existed in the early states of America. It was minimum amount of things. The government was very unobtrusive and very efficient, and it wasn't very expensive. By the way, every empire has been that way. The Romans were that way at the beginning. Very efficient. They were very good things because they followed these principles. These are built into the human order, even if they're not believers. If you do these things, then things work right even if you don't believe anything. You have Satan's dominion spreading. He wants to control things. That's why you have brutal husbands and marriages. You have brutal governments. You have terrible employers. That was reason the rise of the unions was to get away from these tyrants that were employers. And you want to have, it becomes, and then you have marital perversion, like you had Sodom and Gomorrah, all these things. These are not good for anything. Not good for the kids, they're not good for the wives, they're not good for the husbands. But Satan wants to pervert the good order that God had set up, and then it becomes dysfunctional. You have genders and everything. I was wondering, they introduced sex education back when I was in high school, junior high and high school. And my grandmother, who at that time was not a believer, went after it in Lawrence, Kansas, went after the superintendent of schools, and she was a doctor's wife, my grandfather, and about tore this guy apart. And she says, this is going to turn out to be no good. And she was exactly right. Even though she wasn't a believer, she understood what the order is supposed to be. And I said, is this what this dysfunctional view that's taught in schools of different sexes and transes and homosexuals and lesbians and all this stuff? I said, didn't they study any biology or any sex or education? What was this involved in this thing? It's an indoctrination program going the opposite way of what is true science. It's not we're against science, we're for the real thing. And even nature, the genetics people know this, all this stuff. Oh, no, all these things are meant to be, as Steve meant. He was a superintendent of a large school district here down in Kansas City. These things isn't the function of the educational system. It's the function of the family. That's where everything comes from. Where do the kids come from? From the schools? No. Doesn't anyone understand anything? I mean, these are basics. And yet we've come so far that they think that's normal and things. And even if you educate your kids as far as work, where'd the kids learn how to work? Where'd I learn? With my father and the people that worked with him. Where'd I pick up my skills and everything? And you work as an apprentice for someone, and they teach you. And they benefit, but they don't pay you much at that point, but then you become a master yourself. Yeah. Social entropy. There are physical laws, entropy, where everything's going to disorder. Well, we have the same thing in social deals. The amount of energy or motivation increasingly unavailable for doing good work performance in a given social system. It is distinguished in the decline of a society or nation by increasingly negative behaviors, alienation from proper and original intent, selfishness, deviation, and eventually collapse when it reaches a total state of anarchy. This is a quote from a professor from UCLA. When I began studying the notion of entropy, it became clear to me that thermal dynamic entropy is merely one instance of the concept of much broader applications. I became convinced that entropy applies to social phenomena as well. In other words, if you have a refined system, you start throwing things in and it becomes disordered. That's what we're seeing today. That's what they call law and order. Yeah. Oops. You have to get back there. What he did is he traced these societies and the different social orders and the way they went, and they started a downhill climb. That's what the rise and fall of nations, the whole concept, the historical view of nations is that way. You look at, even at the time of Augustine, was about 400 AD, and a friend of his had to deal with a proconsul in North Africa from the emperor that came down there to try and sort out some parts of society. And he got in an argument with one of his colleagues, Augustine's colleagues. And so he asked Augustine, write something against it. And he wrote what became a classic work. And in that, he traces how the Roman government declined. And he said, you teach, this is in 400 AD, what Cicero, you teach in your theaters and things, what Cicero and the other founders of the Roman Empire would scream as being wrong. He says, you won't even take your grandmothers and your mothers to these plays. They're so raunchy. And he said, that because the argument was society is going down because we became Christian. We turned away from the ancient gods. He says, no. It's because you turned away from the gods of his ethics and everything, and that he laid down. And we're suffering from that. We're collapsing because of that. The Roman Empire, and he uses example after example after example of why this thing was collapsing. He says, that wasn't how Rome was set up. You destroyed it all. It's collapsing from within, not from without. It's not the pagans attacking us. It says we have nothing left. Look at our army. Terrible. And he just went after thing after thing. It was in the City of God, the book. It took him 14 years to write it. But he laid down why this. But this is all societies, you see them rise and fall. They disintegrate from within. And that's why they call it social entropy. Well, what you have, like I said, the God's established in, like in Ephesians, Colossians, this social pattern of each of these areas of the family. And we have the women's fib. Feminism, I'm sorry. and putting this deal. And women are, like my mother said, she said, women are as smart as men, but God set things up in a certain order. This is even before she's a believer. And said, this is the way the thing is. And my mother was a tough gal. I mean, she collected snakes, if you can believe that. My father said she was a snake girl. And they dated, and the other guy said, be careful with her, she collects snakes and everything, and she's a tough woman. But she understood the way society is. And we were in a liberal church background, and when she was becoming a believer, she walked out a number of times, and my dad was the head of the official board, chairman of that runs the whole church, 2,000 members. She yanked him, and they walked out of there. She's not a woman. She says, I don't like these feminists. She said, several of her friends complained. They said, they're ruining the whole thing. The men used to go out and work, and they brought in the money, and we got to spend it. Now we got to go out and make our own money. This system doesn't work. But they were stable homes and everything with a patriarchal system, and the women were treated nicely. There was chivalry, and you got up for older people, and everything was done in a nice way, even if you're in a crowded bus. Everyone younger got up, and she got her seat. And if it's an old man, the same way. So there were these societies. This has all disappeared. And our society is centered. And work, hey, how many of these people, I hire people, or I have in the past, I've decreased a lot. These younger generations, they don't know anything. I mean, college-educated people, they can't even, a guy that graduated mechanical engineering from Georgia Tech, one of the best, didn't even know how to use a ratchet. His father was saying such great things because we took his son and ran him through the mill where he could not only use a ratchet, but learn to weld and a few other things. He thanked us greatly for that. But why don't they learn that? Well, their job is just to make money. They don't love their work. We all loved it. Why? Because at the end of the day, we left something. It was better than when we arrived. And we generated more goods than we consumed. When I lived in Africa in Africa for about 6 years, lived among the Arabs, and then did some work in sub-Saharan Africa. And I said, listen, to sub-Saharan Uganda and there in Kenya, I said, you have more resources than practically the rest of the world. I said, a country like Uganda, you can just lie under the fruit tree and let it drop in your mouth and live forever. They said, unless it's a jackfruit, that was a deal about this big, and then it'd knock your head off. But I said, why don't you do well? You are a consuming society. You get aid. You not only don't produce enough to support yourself, you consume all the aid coming in here. And why is it bad? Corruption. Bunch of corruption. And you, from your own tribe, you want your guy in that's corrupt so he can rob the government and pay off the family and the clan. I said, is this the way it works? I said, do you think Americans went over there in America and found money hanging on all the trees and all they went down was collected? I said, no, when my ancestors went there, it was cold, bitter, and they had to live inside houses. I said, it's a lot worse than Africa. Your temperature is beautiful. I said, what's the problem? I said, you turned away from the scriptures, and even as professing Christians, you don't follow them. I said, what do you expect is going to happen? Do you think God's going to bless this? He's not going to bless it. And what we're living in as a society, they check off God. I was a city commissioner in Lawrence. This is in the late 80s and 90s. And my biggest struggle was the people coming off of the hill down there. They had most cockeyed views of things, of society, and everything. And I said, what in the world? Where did these people get these ideas? These are very intelligent together. And they're teaching these students these things? I said, maybe I live in another dimension. I walked in everything. And we'd have Kansas. shooting fish in. They come up with these things, shoot it apart, and the students are.
At you or the professor?
About 3 runs.
Just a couple of. You want to talk about our talk about people.
I was young enough for Nixon. From the time of Eisenhower to the present, Eisenhower wasn't a general, everything, but we've seen a decline. Kennedy, right on down the Obama, terrible, and even the Republicans too. And in the House, things say, where are these things coming from? Where are these people? They're just political prostitutes. They are not people of principle. And even guys like Dirksen, who wasn't a believer, senator from Illinois, tougher than nails. He says, you cannot build a nation on debt. You cannot spend yourself into prosperity. He says $1 million here, $1 million there. Pretty soon we're talking about billions. And it's money we haven't ever generated in the society. That's what we see. We see it's going to be a catastrophic failure from an economic point of view. It's traditional. Empires and everyone, they start spending money they don't bring in. Then they become oppressive to the people to try and get more money. And we're seeing that. From a social point of view, we're seeing a collapse. I think this election of Trump back is a reprieve. The guy's not a believer, but we have a reprieve maybe for 4 years. And I think that it's a divine deal. God uses pagans to run society, and I think we've got a reprieve for maybe 4 years. But unless there's a repentance in our society of the population, not the politicians. The politicians are just a reflection of our leadership, just like in Israel. They had bad kings, they had bad people, and they got bad kings. Judah, most of them were good, and they had a good thing, and they survived for a long time. When you have bad people and unrepentant people, you're going to have a bad government. So we're the fault. When we look at the leaders are just a reflection of us. So whatever our political views are, who we choose or who's running us, and we get what we paid for. And so if you want this reprieve, take it for what it's worth. It won't be forever if we follow this trend that's going down. But fortunately, I'll tell you the nice thing. This is the great thing. This life isn't everything. It is just a forerunner, and it's hard on us to establish us as good people. You never grow into good times. Israel never prospered spiritually under good circumstances. Prosperity was an inverse function, if you want to put it to spirituality. When they were down on their face in the mud, it's when they got serious with God. And until we get serious, or if we don't, we're history. Tragedy is that we don't show up in the prophecies. A nation like the United States doesn't show up in the prophecies as a prominent player in the end times. If we're approaching that, with the return of Israel in 1948, I think the clock's starting. We're running as a world system. But for us as believers, we can suffer anything we want here. But the game comes over, walk through those portals of death, everything's different. All these people that are important now, they have another destiny. And ours, why are we going to get there? Because we're good people? No. Because we're accepting what Christ did. That's what makes us holy, walk in there. But while we're here, we want to grow spiritually. Every day, we want to get more and more sin out of our lives. It's like trying steel, it talks about silver that's tried 7 times. I don't know how you know about purifying silver. You boil it, and all the impurities come off the top. You rake it off, you start it again, and boil some more off. Pretty soon you got pure silver and everything. And we don't like persecution. We don't like the hard life, but those are the things that are going to make us the people that are going to walk into eternity and be happy with. You don't have to walk in with a lot of money. You don't have to walk in with a lot of good health. You don't have to walk in with anything. In fact, you won't walk in with anything. But we get to be there because of what he's done, then it lasts forever. We live in a city of gold forever. Each of us will have more, live in it says a mansion that Christ is going to prepare. He says, don't worry, I'm going to prepare a place for you. It's going to have more gold in it than all the gold that's ever been mined in all of history. You know how big all the gold is? It's a cube about 60 feet by 60 feet by 60 feet. That's a mansion maybe if you turned it all into one house. But each of us will have that, and it won't perish, and it won't disappear. And there will be no bad people there to plague us. And we'll get to see God face to face because we'll be clean. We won't sin anymore. We sin every day of our life. I think God's kept us that way so that we're humble. We realize that it's him that's done it for us. He's going to take us to the goal. You know, you ever see them bumper sticker? He that dies with the most toys wins. I said, that's wrong. That guy doesn't know the truth. Yeah, yeah. Can you imagine? It's like Jesus told about the rich man and Lazarus. Oh, rich man had all those things. Then it says, and he woke up in torment. And where's Lazarus? He wasn't with Abraham. This is before they're resurrected. The Old Testament saints. They couldn't go until Christ rose. And he says, send Lazarus over and come and cool my tongue. I'm tormented in this flame. There's a chasm between us. We can't come over there and you can't come here. He says, well, I've got 5 brothers. Send Lazarus back and warn my brothers. He says, they won't believe Moses and the prophets. They won't believe even if one returns from the dead. And he's returned from the dead. They still don't. But he can't get out. Rich man couldn't get out, and his 5 brothers are coming to the same place. So the game's over. It's just like that billboard I saw the other day out here on the turnpike. It says, life has lots of choices. Eternity only has 2, which is yours. You know, so we look, that's what I'm talking about. Science is the world of reality. You work with what's real. You don't make up the rules and think you're going to get there. And in life, we don't make up the rules. None of us, people say, well, that's what you believe, and this is what I believe. No, it doesn't make any difference what anyone believes. What is going to be the reality of whatever? And that's why Jesus had to come, perfect man, perfect God, and die for us, rescue us from ourselves. It's unbelievable.
All right. How about a round of applause for that preacher? Good job, Dave. Okay, it's time to go. Wait a minute. Next week is fun. It's going to be exciting. We got some videos on the latest stuff that we've got, video clips on animals and on, I think, birds. I don't think anything on fish. And then we're going to do some stuff on human beings and some things that we're learning about complexity and so on, about how even more what we're learning with the bigger, more powerful atomic microscopes and things that are just blowing, you know, what you thought was true. Well, it's even more just unbelievable what God put together. So next week is our last session. Remember, the first session we didn't have because of the cold weather and everything. So next week is our last session. We'll see you then. Thanks for coming.